Scott McConnell stabbed the intercom button on his desk phone. Marianne, get me the latest numbers on Medicorp's settlement offers. Until Walter, I'm not attending the partners' lunch today. Mr. McConnell, Mr. Fry specifically requested. I don't care what Walter requested. I've got 300 families waiting for justice, and Medicorp's lawyers are trying to bury us in paperwork. The lunch can wait. Scott turned to the stack of medical records on his desk, each one representing a life destroyed by Medicorp's negligence. The view of Boston Harbor through his corner office windows at Morrison and Fitzgerald held no interest for him today. He'd earned that view through 17 years of ruthless dedication, taking on cases other lawyers feared to touch, and he wasn't about to let it distract him from his biggest fight yet. His phone buzzed again. Mr. McConnell, Gail Sosa is here for her appointment. Send her in. Gail Sosa entered his office clutching her daughter's photograph. 3 years had passed since Maria's death, but the pain in Gail's eyes remained as fresh as the day she'd first walked into his office. Mrs. Sosa, please sit down. Scott gestured to the chair across from his desk. I have updates on the class action suit. They offered another settlement, didn't they? Gail's voice carried a sharp edge. How much this time? $20 million for the entire class. Scott's jaw tightened, plus a confidentiality agreement and no admission of wrongdoing. That's less than last time. Gail's fingers tightened around the photograph frame. They think we're getting desperate. They're wrong. Scott pulled out a thick folder. We've uncovered evidence of systemic negligence dating back 2 decades. Quality control reports were falsified. Safety protocols ignored. And that's just the beginning. How many others? Gail asked. How many families like mine? 300 confirmed cases. Potentially thousands more we haven't documented yet. Scott leaned forward. Mrs. Sosa, I need you to understand something. Many courts' lawyers will keep pushing settlements. The numbers will get bigger. But if we hold out, if we get this in front of a jury. I didn't come to you for money, Mr. McConnell. Gail set her daughter's photograph on his desk. Maria was 17. She wanted to be a doctor. The medication that killed her was supposed to help her heart condition. Instead, it poisoned her. Her voice cracked. I want them to admit what they did. I want everyone to know. Scott nodded, his expression hardening. Then we keep fighting. I've got a team working through decades of internal documents. Falsify tests, covered up deaths, executives who chose profits over safety. We're going to expose all of it. A knock at the door interrupted them. Scott's wife, Heather, entered wearing her mask, general surgical scrubs. Sorry to interrupt. I tried calling. She stopped short at seeing Gail. Dr. McInnes. Gail stood. I didn't realize. Mrs. Sosa, please stay seated. Scott gestured for his wife to wait. We're almost finished here. Heather's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Of course, I'll wait outside. After Heather left, Scott turned back to Gail. We have a hearing next week before Judge Chandler. He's known for being tough on corporate defendants. If we can show him the pattern of negligence, they'll try to stop you. Gail interrupted. Medicorp, they have too much to lose. Scott's expression darkened. Let them try. I'd spent 3 years building this case. Attempts they've made to bury evidence. Witnesses they've tried to silence. It's all documented. They can't hide anymore. After Gail left, Heather returned. That was one of the Medicorp victims' families. Maria Sosa's mother, the contaminated heart medication case. Scott began organizing documents into his briefcase. What brings you here in the middle of the day? Nathan's science fair is tonight. You promised you'd be there. Heather perched on the edge of his desk. He's presenting his project on DNA analysis. First place could mean a summer internship at the university. Scott paused. I've got depositions until 6. Then I need to prep for next week's hearing. He's 14, Scott. He needs his father there. What he needs is to understand that some things are worth sacrificing for. Scott snapped his briefcase shut. This case could save thousands of lives. set precedents that forced pharmaceutical companies to put safety before profits. In the next case, and the one after that, Heather stood. There's always another crusade, Scott. Always another battle that can't wait. Meanwhile, your son is growing up without you. That's not fair. I make time. When? Between depositions, during court recesses, Heather's voice carried an edge he'd been hearing more often lately. Nathan's not asking for much. Just one evening. Scott's phone buzzed again. Mr. McConnell, your deposition team is ready in conference room 3. I have to go. Scott gathered his files. Tell Nathan. Tell him I'll make it up to him this weekend. We'll go to that robotics exhibition he mentioned. Heather's expression hardened. I'll tell him. Though they both knew something else would come up. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. You know what the ironic part is. You're so focused on saving everyone else's families. You can't see what's happening to your own. The door closed behind her with a finality that should have worried Scott more than it did. But his mind was already on the depositions ahead, on the evidence he needed to present to Judge Chandler, on the justice he'd promised Gail Sosa and hundreds of other families. He didn't notice Heather lingering outside his office, or the way she pulled out her phone and typed a quick message. We need to talk. Tonight. Same place. The response came almost immediately. I'll be there. W.E. Judge Albert Chandler's chambers at the federal courthouse felt more like a library than an office. Legal volumes lined the walls, their spines cracked and worn from decades of use. The judge himself sat behind his massive oak desk, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed the documents before him. This pattern of negligence spans 20 years. Scott stood before the desk, shoulders squared. Medicorp didn't just fail to maintain proper quality control. They actively concealed evidence of contamination. People died while they covered up the truth. Strong allegations, Mr. McConnell. Chandler peered over his glasses. I assume you have evidence to support them. 3 years' worth. Scott placed another folder on the desk, including internal memos showing executives knew about the contamination risks. They calculated it would be cheaper to pay occasional settlements than fix their manufacturing processes. Your Honor. Medicorp's lead counsel, James Barrett, interjected from his chair. These documents were obtained through discovery. They're covered by confidentiality agreements, which don't apply when the documents show evidence of criminal conduct. Scott's voice carried the cold precision of a blade. Page 37. Your Honor. A memo from Francis Arroyo himself, ordering quality control reports to be falsified. Chandler picked up the document, his expression grave. Mr. Barrett, your client's conduct appears to go beyond mere negligence. These documents suggest a deliberate pattern of deception. We dispute the authenticity of those documents. Barrett started to rise. And we have serious concerns about how Mr. McConnell's team obtained them. Through proper discovery channels, every step documented. Scott's interruption carried a note of contempt. Unlike your client's habit of accidentally shredding evidence. Gentlemen. Chandler's tone ended the exchange. Mr. McConnell, I'll review these materials carefully. Mr. Barrett, I suggest you advise your client that attempting to seal or destroy evidence will not be viewed favorably by this court. He removed his glasses. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning for my ruling on class certification. Outside the judge's chambers, Barrett caught up to Scott. You're making a mistake, McConnell. Medicorp prepared to increase the settlement offer substantially. Save it. Scott didn't break stride. Your client had chances to make this right. Instead, they chose to hide evidence and blame the victims. Now they'll face the consequences. You're not thinking this through. Barrett grabbed Scott's arm, forcing him to stop. This goes deeper than you know. People in positions of power. Scott jerked his arm free. Was that a threat, James? Because if so, you should choose your next words very carefully. Barrett stepped back, adjusting his tie. Just friendly advice. Some fights aren't worth the cost. Scott leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper. Tell Francis Arroyo that if he wants to threaten me, he should do it himself. And tell him that when I'm done, he won't just lose his company. He'll lose his freedom. As Scott walked away, he didn't notice Tasha O'Donnell, Judge Chandler's clerk, watching the exchange from around the corner. She waited until Scott was gone before pulling out her phone and dialing quickly. "Judge, it's Tasha. We need to talk. It's about those suspicious rulings you asked me to review. I found something. Something big." She glanced around the empty hallway. "Not over the phone. Can you meet tonight?" In his office at Morrison and Fitzgerald, Walter Fry ended another call, his expression dark. He pressed the intercom. "Get me Francis Arroyo at Medicorp. Secure line." The connection took less than a minute. "Walter, tell me you have good news. Chandler's going to rule against us." Walter's fingers drummed on his desk. McConnell found the quality control memos. Impossible. Those were destroyed years ago. Apparently not all of them. Walter's jaw tightened. He has enough to prove systematic negligence. Once this gets to a jury, it can't get to a jury. Arroyo's voice carried an edge of panic. "Do you understand what happens if this goes public? The stock will crash. Regulators will swarm in. Everything we've built." "Calm down, Francis." Walter's tone remained measured. "There are ways to handle this, but they'll be expensive and permanent." A long pause followed. "Whatever it costs. Just make it go away. I'll set things in motion. But Francis, remember who saved your company. The existing arrangements between Medicorp and the firm will need to be renegotiated." After ending the call, Walter buzzed his assistant. "Get me Eugene Glover from tax, and find out where Scott McConnell's wife takes her lunch breaks." The news of Judge Chandler's murder exploded through Boston's legal community like a bomb. Found beaten to death with his own gavel, the respected federal judge had been investigating a pattern of suspicious rulings that suddenly seemed far more sinister. Detective Sarah Chun stood in the judge's chambers, now a crime scene. Blood spattered the law books. The heavy bronze gavel lay nearby, its surface smeared red. "Time of death?" Chun asked the medical examiner. "Between 9 and 11 last night," Dr. Rogers pointed to the judge's head. "Multiple blunt force traumas. The killer was right-handed, based on the angle of the wounds. And strong." Chun nodded toward a broken cufflink near the desk. "Monogrammed, SM in silver. Found traces of blood in the parking garage." Her partner added, "Level B2. Space 127. Registered to Scott McConnell." Chun finished. "Morrison and Fitzgerald star litigator. He argued a major case before Chandler yesterday. Security footage shows him entering the building at 9:47 p.m. Her partner checked his notes. No footage of him leaving, because the cameras on the east exit were conveniently malfunctioning. Chun's expression hardened. "Get me everything on McConnell. Cases, finances, personal life, and find out what case he argued yesterday." The investigation moved with frightening speed. Each piece of evidence seemed perfectly placed, a trail of breadcrumbs leading to Scott McConnell's door. In the grand jury room, Mary Ann Friedman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. He became obsessed with the Medicorp case. I'd never seen him like that before. The anger, the paranoia. "Did Mr. McConnell ever threaten Judge Chandler?" the prosecutor asked. "Not directly," but Mary Ann hesitated. "The day before, after the hearing, I overheard him on the phone. He said, one way or another, this ends tomorrow." He sounded dangerous. The testimony of Eugene Glover, Morrison, and Fitzgerald's tax attorney proved even more damaging. "I discovered irregularities in Mr. McConnell's finances, offshore accounts, untraceable transfers. When I confronted him, he said some things were worth any cost. But it was Heather's testimony that sealed Scott's fate. She sat in the witness box, her composure perfect, her words measured. Scott changed after taking the Medicorp case. He became consumed by it. Aggressive. Paranoid. He stopped coming home. Stopped attending Nathan's events." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. The night Judge Chandler died, Scott came home late. His clothes, there was blood. He said it was nothing, that he'd had a nosebleed, but his hands were shaking. The jury never saw the text message he sent during a recess. "It's done. He'll never suspect." Or the reply from Walter. "You were perfect. Everything's proceeding as planned." The trial itself felt like a formality. Scott's defense team seemed oddly unprepared, missing obvious opportunities to challenge evidence or cross-examine witnesses. The prosecutor painted a picture of a man driven to violence by obsession, who murdered a judge to prevent an unfavorable ruling. The jury took 6 hours to find him guilty. As the verdict was read, Scott's eyes locked onto Heather's. For the first time, he saw something in her expression. Not grief or guilt, but triumph. Judge Harrison's voice cut through the courtroom. "Scott McConnell, you have been found guilty of first-degree murder. The nature of this crime, the murder of a federal judge in the course of his duties, demands the most severe punishment. I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." As officers led Scott away, Walter Fry watched from the gallery, his face a mask of appropriate concern. His phone buzzed with a message from Francis Arroyo. "Worth every penny. The partnership agreement is ready to sign." In the corridor outside, Heather met Walter's eyes briefly. No words were exchanged, but their shared glance carried volumes. The perfect frame was complete. Scott McConnell, the righteous crusader, would spend the rest of his life in prison. The Medicorp case would be quietly settled. And the real conspiracy, the web of judicial bribes, corporate corruption, and murder, would remain safely hidden, or so they thought. They didn't notice Nathan McConnell in the back of the courtroom, his young face set in determination as he watched his father led away. They didn't see him slip a small recording device back into his pocket, or notice the way his eyes tracked every movement between his mother and Walter Fry. They had no way of knowing that their perfect crime had planted the seeds of its own destruction. In framing Scott McConnell, they had created an enemy with nothing left to lose, and a son determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The metal doors slammed behind Scott McConnell with a finality that echoed through the concrete corridor of Massachusetts State Penitentiary. Prison guard Thomas Rivera pushed him forward, past rows of cells filled with the state's most dangerous criminals. "Keep moving, counselor," Rivera said. "Your corner office is ready." Scott remained silent, his expression blank. 3 months into his life sentence, he learned that reactions only gave the guards entertainment. Instead, he focused on memorizing his surroundings, distances between checkpoints, guard rotation patterns, security camera positions. His new cellmate, Luther Solis, sat on the bottom bunk reading a dog-eared copy of Sun Tzu's Art of War. He didn't look up as Scott entered. "Cell doors closed in 5, Rivera announced, stepping away. Luther's voice came low and measured. "You're the lawyer, the one who killed the judge." "I didn't kill anyone." Scott placed his few belongings on the top bunk. "That's what everyone says in here." Luther finally looked up, his eyes sharp and assessing. "But most of them are lying." "You're not." Scott turned to face him. "What makes you so sure?" 20 years Special Forces teaches you to read people. The guilty ones, they've got this look, like they're carrying something heavy. You don't have that look." Luther said, his book aside. "You've got the look of someone who's been betrayed." The cell door clanged shut. Scott remained standing, studying his cellmate. "And what's the look of someone planning to do something about it?" A slight smile crossed Luther's face. "Now that's a more interesting conversation." He glanced at the security camera in the corner, then tapped the side of his bunk. "Sid, let's talk about your appeals process." Over the next few weeks, Scott established a routine. During the day, he helped other inmates with their legal paperwork, building a network of grateful allies. At night, he and Luther talked strategy. "Your first mistake was trusting the system," Luther said one evening, voice barely above a whisper. "Courts, lawyers, judges, They're all part of the same corrupt machine. I was part of that machine, Scott replied. I thought I could use it to fight for justice. And now I know better. Scott's voice carried a dangerous edge. The system protected the guilty and condemned the innocent. When I get out of here, I'm going to tear it down. Luther nodded approvingly. That's why I'm going to introduce you to some people. Men like us, who've seen the truth about justice in America. Ex-military, intelligence officers, operators, all wrongly convicted, but not without resources. What kind of resources? The kind that can reach beyond these walls. Luther pulled out a contraband phone, carefully shielded from camera view. We've maintained our networks, eyes and ears in places that matter. People who owe us favors. Scott considered this. And why would they help me? Because you're not the first person framed by powerful people. We've been watching Morrison and Fitzgerald for years. Your case, it fits a pattern. A knock on their cell wall interrupted them. Luther quickly concealed the phone. That's Johnson, former CIA analyst 3 cells down. He's got something to show you. During yard time the next day, Scott met Richard Johnson, a weathered man in his 60s who spent most of his time in the prison library. Your son's been busy, Johnson said, sliding a newspaper across the table. Nathan McConnell, age 14, won the state science fair with a project on digital forensics and data recovery. Scott picked up the paper, studying the photo of his son accepting the award. Nathan's expression wasn't of triumph, it was of determination. He's not just studying forensics, Johnson continued. He's been meeting with someone, a girl named Jackie Birch. Birch, any relation to Sarah Birch? Her sister, Sarah, died from Medicorp's contaminated medication last year. Johnson leaned forward. These kids, they're not just science fair partners. They're digging into your case. Scott's hands tightened on the newspaper. They're just children. If Walter finds out, that's why we're going to help them. Luther interjected, joining them. Johnson's got contacts at MIT's computer science department. They can guide the kids, keep them safe while they work. And what about Heather? Scott's voice turned cold. She's still their mother. We've been watching her too, Johnson said. She spends 3 nights a week at the Four Seasons. Room registered to Walter Fry. Scott's expression didn't change, but his knuckles whitened. How long? Based on hotel records. Johnson replied. 3 years. Started right around the time you took the Medicorp case. Luther watched his cellmate carefully. Most men would break at news like this. Scott just nodded, processing the information with lethal calm. They think they've won, he said finally. They think I'm locked away, powerless. But they forgot something important. What's that? Johnson asked. A man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous enemy of all. Scott's voice carried absolute conviction. I'm going to destroy them. Not just expose them. Destroy them. Take everything they have, everything they care about. And I'm going to do it legally, so they can watch it happen and know they can't stop it. Luther exchanged glances with Johnson. This was why they'd chosen to help Scott McConnell. Not because he was innocent, but because he had the will and the capability to bring down an entire corrupt system. Then let's get started, Luther said. Johnson's got access to prison surveillance footage. I've got men on the outside ready to move. And your son? He's already laying the groundwork. Scott looked at the newspaper photo again, seeing Nathan's determination in a new light. Tell me everything you know about Jackie Birch. If these kids are going to help expose the truth, we need to make sure they're protected. Max McFarlane sat in his car outside the Boston Globe building, waiting. 3 cups of cold coffee littered the dashboard, testament to hours of surveillance. His target finally emerged. Sophia Hatfield. Max called out, stepping from his car. We need to talk about Scott McConnell. Sophia's hand moved toward her pepper spray. I don't discuss ongoing investigations with. I was his private investigator for 12 years. Max held up his hands. And I can prove he didn't kill Judge Chandler. 20 minutes later, They sat in a back booth at O'Malley's bar, away from surveillance cameras. "Why come to me?" Sophia asked, studying the files Max had brought. "Why not take this to the police? Because half the Boston PD is in Morrison and Fitzgerald's pocket." Max pulled out more documents. "Look at these accident reports. 6 Medicorp whistleblowers in the past decade. All died in accidents right before they could testify." Sophia flipped through the reports. "These look legitimate on the surface. That's how they operate. Everything looks clean until you dig deeper." Max leaned forward. "I spent the last 3 months connecting the dots. Judge Chandler wasn't just handling the Medicorp case. He was investigating other judges, ones who consistently ruled in favor of Morrison and Fitzgerald's clients. You're talking about systematic judicial corruption. I'm talking about murder, bribery, and corporate conspiracy." Max pulled out one more file. "And I think Judge Chandler's clerk can prove it." Finding Tasha O'Donnell proved challenging. After Chandler's murder, she disappeared from public view, taking a leave of absence from the court. "She's scared," Sophia said during one of their meetings. "And with good reason. I found 3 attempts to access her bank records last month. Someone's looking for her." "We need to get to her first," Max insisted. "She was with Chandler the day before his murder. She knows something." It took 2 more weeks to track Tasha down. She was staying with relatives in New Hampshire, using her maiden name. "I can't help you," Tasha said when they finally met, her hands shaking as she poured coffee. "You don't understand what these people are capable of." "We understand perfectly," Sophia replied. "That's why we're here." Judge Chandler kept notes, didn't he? About the cases he was investigating. Tasha's silence was answer enough. "Listen to me," Max said quietly. "Scott McConnell is in prison for a murder he didn't commit. His 14-year-old son is out there trying to clear his father's name. Meanwhile, the Rayall killers are walking free, probably planning their next move. They'll kill me." Tasha's voice broke. "Like they killed him." "Not if we move first." Sophia pulled out her recorder. "Tell us everything. Every detail. We'll protect you. Get your story out so broadly that silencing you would only confirm your testimony." Slowly, painfully, Tasha began to talk. She described Judge Chandler's growing suspicions about certain cases, how he documented irregular patterns and rulings favorable to Morrison and Fitzgerald's clients, the threatening phone calls he'd received. The day before it happened, Chandler's voice grew stronger. "He showed me something. A pattern of payments through offshore accounts. Millions of dollars moving through shell companies, always just before major rulings. We need those records," Max said. "I have them." Tasha went to her bedroom, returned with a thick envelope. Everything he found. Bank transfers, dates of rulings, phone records. He made copies, gave them to me for safekeeping. As Max and Sophia examined the documents, another ally was making her own moves. Kirsten Daniel, Walter Fry's assistant for 8 years, had spent months documenting her boss's suspicious activities. "Mr. Fry, your dinner reservation at La Pouliere is confirmed for 8, Kirsten said, entering Walter's office. "Will Dr. McInnes be joining you?" Walter barely looked up from his phone. "Clear my schedule for tomorrow night as well." "And Kirsten, this stays off the official calendar." "Of course, sir." Kirsten made notes, just as she had for countless other secret meetings. Each one documented, time-stamped, photographed when possible. That evening, she sat in her small apartment, organizing her evidence, photos of Walter and Heather entering hotels, records of wire transfers to offshore accounts, copies of documents she'd seen him shred. Her phone buzzed, a text from her contact at the Four Seasons. "Fry asked about our private dining room. Want a reserve for next month. Looks like a proposal set up." Kirsten's hands tightened on her phone. If Walter married Heather, they'd be legally protected from testifying against each other. Time was running out. She opened her laptop, began composing an email to Max McFarland. She'd found his contact through careful research, verified his connection to Scott McConnell. I have information about Walter Fry and Heather McInnes. She wrote evidence of their affair, their conspiracy against Scott McConnell, and much more. But we need to move quickly. The encryption's military grade, Jackie Birch said, fingers flying over her keyboard. But there's always a way in. Nathan McConnell watched the lines of code scroll across her screen. They converted Jackie's garage into their investigation headquarters, computers and servers humming around them. How did you learn all this? Nathan asked. Jackie's expression hardened. After Sarah died, I wanted answers. Medicorp claimed their systems were too complex to track individual medication batches, so I learned to hack. Turns out their security isn't as good as they think. Nathan nodded. He understood obsession, the need to uncover truth. For 3 months, we've been piecing together digital evidence of his father's frame-up. Got it, Jackie exclaimed. Email server access. Let me set up a search algorithm. Messages began populating their screen. Thousands were exchanged between his mother and Walter Fry. Nathan's face remained impassive as he read their intimate exchanges, their plans, their celebrations of his father's conviction. 3 years of betrayal documented in bits and bytes. There's more, Jackie said quietly. Financial records. Look at these transfers. The numbers are staggering. Millions moving through a complex web of offshore accounts, all controlled by Morrison and Fitzgerald partners. Each transfer correlates with a major ruling. Nathan noted checking dates. Judge Thompson's dismissal of the Parker lawsuit. Judge Martinez throwing out evidence in the Weber case. Your dad was getting too close, Jackie said. The Medicorp case would have exposed everything. They worked through the night, documenting every connection. Jackie's programs traced money flows, while Nathan analyzed patterns and court decisions. A knock at the garage door froze them both. Jackie quickly minimized their screens. It's okay. A man's voice called. I'm Richard Johnson's friend from MIT. Luther sent me. They exchanged glances. Luther, Nathan's father's cellmate. The connection they'd been promised. Dr. James Chan entered carrying computer equipment. Impressive setup. But you need better security if you're going to go after people like this. Who are you exactly? Nathan asked. Someone who knows how dangerous this game is. Chan set down his equipment. Luther asked me to help keep you safe while you work. First rule, no direct attacks on Medicorp servers. They'll trace it back to you. Then how do we get the evidence we need? Jackie demanded. By being smarter than them. Chan pulled out a flash drive. This contains advanced encryption tools and secure communication channels. He produced another drive. Something interesting from the courthouse security system. Nathan's eyes narrowed. The missing footage from the night Judge Chandler died. Supposedly corrupted beyond recovery. But data is never truly gone if you know where to look. They spent hours processing the video files. When the image finally resolved, they watched Walter Fry enter Judge Chandler's chambers at 10:13 p.m., carrying a wrapped package, the murder weapon. Jackie whispered, he brought it as a gift. We need to get this to someone who can help, Nathan said. Someone who can't be bought. Not yet, Chin warned. The conspiracy's reach is wider than you know. 2 witnesses have already died in accidents. We need more. Enough evidence that they can't bury it. Nathan stared at his mother's emails, her plans with Walter, her betrayal of his father. His expression matched Scott's in its intensity. Then we'll get more, he said. Email. Transfer. Corrupt ruling. We'll build a case so strong they won't know what hit them until it's too late. Jackie squeezed his hand. We're going to free your dad, Nathan, and make them pay for what they did to Sarah. Detective Sarah Chun watched them work. These teenage crusaders with adult determination. They were their parents' children. Jackie with her sister's sense of justice. Nathan with his father's relentless drive. The corrupt system that had condemned Scott McConnell never saw them coming. While the conspirators celebrated their perfect crime, 2 teenagers were slowly, systematically gathering the digital weapons that would tear their world apart. But first, they had to survive long enough to use them. The appeals court chamber buzzed with anticipation. Manicourt's legal team sat confidently, their evidence neatly organized. Walter Fry and Heather McInnes occupied front row seats, their expressions showing only mild concern. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The Honorable Judge Martinez presiding. Scott entered in prison orange, chains at his wrists and ankles. His eyes swept the room, noting each familiar face. Walter, Heather, Francis Arroyo, Eugene Glover, the corrupt jury foreman, Craig Fitzpatrick. "Your Honor," Robbie Doherty approached the bench. "The defense requests permission to present new evidence." Objection. The prosecutor stood. This appeal was scheduled to review existing case materials only. "Your Honor," Robbie continued, "what I'm about to present proves not only my client's innocence, but exposes a criminal conspiracy reaching into this very courtroom." Judge Martinez frowned. "That's a serious allegation, Counselor. And I can prove every word." Robbie nodded to his assistant, who began distributing thick binders to the court. "What you're holding," Robbie announced, "is evidence of systematic corruption involving Medicorp, Morrison and Fitzgerald, and multiple officers of the court." Walter's hand tightened on Heather's arm. In the gallery, Francis Arroyo shifted uncomfortably. First, Robbie activated a presentation screen. Financial records showing millions in payments from Medicorp to offshore accounts controlled by Morrison and Fitzgerald partners. Graphs and bank statements appeared, each transaction highlighted. Walter's face paled as he recognized his own account numbers. "These payments," Robbie continued, "coincide perfectly with favorable court rulings, but that's just the beginning." He nodded to the bailiff, who opened the courtroom doors. Max McFarland entered, leading a group of former Medicorp executives. These witnesses will testify how Medicorp systematically falsified drug trials, buried evidence of contamination, and arranged accidents for whistleblowers. The prosecutor jumped up. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "What's irregular," Robbie cut in, "is how many judges receive payments from these same offshore accounts, including some in this very courthouse." Judge Martinez stiffened. "Mr. Doherty, you're treading dangerous ground." "No, Your Honor," Robbie replied. "I'm exposing it." Robbie produced another document. "This is Judge Chandler's personal notebook, preserved by his clerk, Tasha O'Donnell." Tasha stood in the gallery, surrounded by federal marshals for protection. The notebook details Judge Chandler's investigation into judicial corruption. The day before his murder, he documented a meeting with Walter Fry, where Mr. Fry attempted to bribe him to throw out the Medicorp case. Walter surged to his feet. "This is absurd. You can't." "We can. And we will." Robbie's voice filled the courtroom. But perhaps the most damaging evidence comes from closer to home. The screen changed, showing security footage from Judge Chandler's chambers. Walter Fry entered, carrying a wrapped package. This supposedly corrupted footage shows Mr. Fry entering the judge's chambers at 10:13 p.m., carrying the murder weapon disguised as a gift. 16 minutes later, he exits alone. Heather gripped Walter's arm. "You said that footage was destroyed." "It gets worse," Robbie continued. He played an audio recording, Walter's voice discussing the murder with Heather. "We had no choice. He was going to expose everything." The courtroom erupted. Federal agents moved in, surrounding Walter and Heather. Francis Arroyo bolted for the door, but found his path blocked by Luther's men. "Your Honor," Robbie raised his voice above the chaos, "I move for my client's immediate release and request federal prosecutors take custody of these conspirators." Scott sat quietly, watching his enemy's world collapse. Everything he'd built over 2 years, pieces of evidence, witnesses, recordings, now tightened around their necks. 3 weeks later, Scott stood in his new office at the Justice Reform Initiative, watching news coverage of the arrests. Francis Arroyo, CEO of pharmaceutical giant Medicorp, was apprehended today attempting to flee the country, the reporter announced. This follows the arrest of multiple Morrison and Fitzgerald partners and several federal judges implicated in a massive corruption scandal. His phone buzzed with a message from Nathan. Mom and Walter's party video is playing again. Scott switched channels. There was Heather raising a champagne glass to perfect crimes and perfect timing. Walter beside her, promising a spectacular proposal. Then federal agents swarming in, handcuffs replacing engagement rings. You're not watching that again, are you? Scott turned to find Nathan in the doorway, Jackie beside him. Both teenagers looked older, harder, their innocence replaced by understanding of justice's true cost. Just making sure I didn't miss anything, Scott replied. How's the new case coming? 3 more wrongful convictions identified, Jackie reported. Same pattern. Corporate money, corrupt judges, manufactured evidence. Good. Get me the files. Scott's voice carried the same intensity that had sustained him in prison. We're just getting started. Luther entered, carrying more documents. Heather's plea deal fell through. Prosecution has too much evidence. Those recordings Kirsten made of her planning your frame-up with Walter. Devastating. What about Walter? Scott asked, trying to bargain, offering to expose other corrupt judges. Luther's smile showed no warmth. Too late for deals. Max's whistleblowers keep coming forward. The whole system is collapsing. Scott nodded, satisfaction in his eyes. And Francis Arroyo. Suicide watch and federal custody. Eugene Glover turned state's evidence. Gave up everything. Even Craig Fitzpatrick confessed to jury tampering. Nathan watched his father, seeing not the broken man they tried to create, but a force of nature who turned prison into a weapon, patience into power. The Justice Reform Initiative is getting calls from all over the country, Nathan said. Other victims of corporate corruption wanting help. Then we help them. Scott's voice carried absolute conviction. What they did to us. The bribes, the murders, the corruption. It's happening everywhere. We're going to find cases, expose conspiracies, free innocent people they've condemned. Jackie squeezed Nathan's hand. Like you helped find justice for Sarah and Maria Sosa. Nathan added, and all the others Medicorp killed. Scott looked at his son, seeing his own determination mirrored there. They tried to destroy me by taking everything. My freedom, my family, my future. Instead, they'd created something more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose and the patience to destroy them completely. Mr. McConnell, his assistant called. Sophia Hatfield is here with another whistleblower. Scott straightened his tie. Send them in. Nathan, Jackie, stay. Watch how this works. There are more conspiracies to uncover, more corrupt judges to expose, and more families to help, Nathan added. Yes, Scott's smile carried no warmth, only purpose. They thought prison would break me. Instead, it taught me that true justice isn't found in courtrooms. It's found in patience, in preparation, in the perfect moment when your enemies realize they never really won at all. The whistleblower entered, carrying documents exposing another corporate conspiracy. Scott McConnell, the man they tried to bury, sat at his desk, ready to tear down another corrupt empire. His enemies had celebrated too early, not realizing that their perfect crime had one fatal flaw. They had underestimated both a father's determination and a son's love. Sometimes, Scott mused, the best revenge isn't just proving your innocence. It's ensuring that justice reaches everyone who thought they were above it. His enemies had valued power and money above all else. Now they had nothing, while Scott had everything that truly mattered. His freedom, his son's love, and the opportunity to help others find justice. 1 year later, Scott McConnell stood at the podium, addressing the crowd gathered for the Justice Reform Initiative's first anniversary. 1 year ago, we promised to fight for those wrongly convicted by corrupt courts and corporate greed, he began. Today, we've helped free 37 innocent people and exposed corruption in 12 state judicial systems. The audience included many familiar faces: Nathan, now 15, Sapasai Jackie Birch, both teens operating laptops that connected to the initiative's growing database of cases. Max McFarland and Sophia Hatfield occupied front-row seats, their investigative partnership having spawned a Pulitzer-nominated series on judicial corruption. But our work is far from finished, Scott continued. Every week brings new cases, new evidence of systemic corruption, and we will not rest until every victim of judicial fraud finds justice. After the ceremony, Luther Solis approached Scott. Latest report from federal custody. Luther reported, Walter's not doing well. 3 shaking attempts in 2 months. Turns out other inmates don't like corrupt lawyers. Scott showed no reaction. And Heather? Maximum security women's facility in Colorado, Luther replied. Requested transfer closer to Boston. Wants to see Nathan. That's his choice to make. Scott watched his son working with Jackie. He hadn't mentioned her since the trial. The initiative's headquarters occupied the entire top floor of a Boston office building. Their legal team, led by Robbie Doherty, had grown to 20 attorneys. Tasha O'Donnell, Judge Chandler's former clerk, ran their judicial investigation unit. The Medicorp fallout continues, Sophia told Scott during their weekly meeting. FDA's discovered contamination in 3 more drug lines. Stocks down 90%. Class action settlements have topped $10 billion. What about Francis Arroyo? Scott asked. Found dead in his cell last week. Natural causes. Sophia's tone suggested otherwise. Eugene Glover's testimony implicated another dozen executives. Trials start next month. Kirsten Daniel had parlayed her evidence against Walter into a position as the initiative's corporate corruption specialist. Her documentation methods became the template for our investigations. We've identified similar patterns in 3 other pharmaceutical companies, she reported. Same methods: bribing judges, falsifying trials, eliminating whistleblowers. Nathan's computer skills had grown exponentially. Working with Jackie, I developed software to detect patterns of judicial corruption through analysis of court records and financial transactions. It's not just pharmaceutical companies anymore. Nathan explained during a strategy session. We're finding the same schemes in energy companies, banks, technology firms. They all use the same methods Walter and Medicorp perfected. Then we'll take them all down, Scott replied, one corrupt empire at a time. 10 years later, the Justice Reform Initiative had become the nation's most powerful watchdog organization. Their Boston headquarters had spawned offices in 12 cities. Their legal team numbered in the hundreds. Their database of corrupt judges and corporate conspiracies had helped federal prosecutors secure over 300 convictions. Scott McConnell, now in his early 50s, had not softened with success. Each victory drove him to find more cases, expose more corruption, and free more innocent victims. Another letter from your mother, Luther mentioned during their morning briefing. Wants parole support. File it with the others, Scott replied without looking up from his files. 9 years into her 30-year sentence, Heather had exhausted her appeals. Walter hadn't survived his 3rd year in prison. Another accident that was never fully investigated. Nathan, 24, and holding dual degrees in law and computer science from Harvard, headed the initiative's technology division. His relationship with Jackie had grown from teenage collaboration to adult partnership. They'd married the previous year. Their wedding was covered by national media, fascinated by the young crusaders who'd helped expose America's largest judicial corruption scandal. Dad, Nathan entered Scott's office, laptop under his arm. You need to see this. Jackie found something in the federal court database. Pattern matches the Medicorp case, but bigger. Scott studied the data his son presented. Financial transfers through offshore accounts. Suspicious deaths of whistleblowers. Judges issuing bizarre rulings that defied law and logic. How many courts? Scott asked. 23 jurisdictions, 6 circuit courts, 2 Supreme Court justices. Nathan's expression matched his father's intensity. This goes higher than anything we've seen before. Scott nodded, familiar fire kindling in his eyes. Get the team together. All of them within hours. The initiative's conference room filled with familiar faces. Max and Sophia, their hair now graying but their investigative skills sharp as ever. Luther, his network of operators having grown into a nationwide intelligence apparatus. Robbie Doherty, who'd argued 30 cases before the Supreme Court. Kirsten Daniel, who trained a new generation in the art of document and corporate crimes. What we're about to undertake, Scott addressed them, will shake the American judicial system to its core. Some of you helped expose the Medicorp conspiracy. This is bigger. This reaches into branches of government, levels of corporate power. They'll fight back. Luther warned, these people, they'd got more resources than Medicorp ever did. Good. Scott's voice carried the same cold determination that had sustained him in prison. Let them fight. Let them think their money and power make them untouchable. We've seen how that ends. 20 years later, the Justice Reform Initiative celebrated its 20th anniversary in a very different America. The judicial corruption scandals they'd exposed had led to sweeping reforms. Corporate liability laws had been strengthened, whistleblower protections enhanced. A new federal agency staffed by initiative veterans monitored judicial conduct and corporate compliance. Scott McConnell's reputation had grown to near mythical status. The man who'd been wrongly imprisoned had transformed his revenge into a crusade that reshaped American justice. Law schools taught courses about the Medicorp case. The initiative's methods became standard practice for investigating corporate corruption. Nathan and Jackie had 3 children. The eldest, Maria, named for Gail Sosa's daughter, showed her grandfather's dedication to justice and her parents' gift for uncovering digital deception. Your dad's been working late again, Jackie mentioned to Nathan one evening. New case. Always, Nathan smiled. Found another conspiracy last week. Smaller than Medicorp, but same playbook. He won't rest until he's exposed them all. In the initiative's headquarters, now occupying a complex of buildings in downtown Boston, Scott reviewed case files with the same intensity he'd shown 20 years earlier. His hair had turned silver, but his purpose remained unchanged. Luther, semi-retired but still running key operations, brought the latest prison report. Heather's dead. Cancer. Refused treatment. Scott signed another document. Did Nathan want to see her? Visited last month. Took the kids. Luther studied his old friend. She tried to explain why she did it. Said she got caught up in Walter's promises, the money, the power. And Nathan told her he hoped she'd found peace. Then he left. Luther shook his head. He's got your strength, Scott, and his mother's ability to understand people. The difference is he uses that understanding to help instead of hurt. The initiative's work had expanded beyond judicial corruption. They'd exposed human trafficking networks, international money laundering schemes, and terrorist financing operations, each case built on lessons learned from the Medicorp conspiracy. Max and Sophia, though officially retired, still consulted on major investigations. Their Pulitzer-winning exposes had inspired a new generation of investigative journalists who worked closely with the initiative. Tasha O'Donnell had become a federal judge, her experience with corruption making her especially effective at detecting judicial misconduct. Kirsten Daniel ran the initiative's training academy, teaching new investigators the methods she'd developed documenting Walter's crimes. Robbie Doherty, now Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, maintained close ties with the initiative. His reforms of judicial oversight had been adopted by courts nationwide. You ever think about retiring? Luther asked Scott one evening. You've accomplished more than anyone thought possible. Scott looked up from the case files on his desk. You know what I learned in prison, Luther. Justice isn't something you achieve. It's something you have to keep fighting for, every day. The moment you think the battle's won, that's when they start rebuilding their corrupt systems. And the personal revenge against Walter, Heather, Medicorp. That's been done for years. That was never just personal. Scott stood, walking to his window, overlooking the city. They thought they could buy justice, control it, use it to destroy innocent lives. What we did, exposing them, destroying them. That was just the beginning. The real mission is making sure no one else can do what they did. In the outer office, Nathan worked late with his daughter, Maria, teaching her the same skills Jackie had once taught him. The legacy of justice continued, strengthened by each generation's determination to fight corruption. "Grandpa," Maria asked during a break, "why do you and Dad work so hard? Haven't you already won?" Scott smiled at his granddaughter, seeing in her the same fire that had driven him for 20 years. "Justice isn't about winning, Maria. It's about never stopping. Corrupt judge we expose, corporate conspiracy we uncover, innocent person we free. That's not victory. That's just proof that the battle needs to be fought again tomorrow." The Justice Reform Initiative had become more than an organization. It was a movement, a force for accountability in a world where money and power still tried to subvert justice. Scott McConnell's legacy wasn't just the thousands of cases they'd exposed or the lives they'd saved. It was the understanding that true justice requires eternal vigilance, and that no conspiracy, no matter how powerful, can withstand the determined pursuit of truth. In his office late at night, Scott often reflected on the path that had led him here. His enemies had tried to destroy him, never realizing they were creating something far more dangerous. A man who understood that justice wasn't found in courtrooms or legal victories, but in the relentless exposure of truth and the protection of the innocent. They had taken everything from him, thinking it would break him. Instead, it had forged him into a weapon against corruption itself. His revenge hadn't ended with their destruction. It had evolved into a mission that would outlive him, carried forward by his son, his granddaughter, and every person who believed that justice was worth fighting for.